my name is Anna Claire Wright, and in this video I'll be presenting about bilingualism and multilingualism. We will begin with bilingualism. According to the American Speech and Hearing Association, bilingualism is defined as the ability to communicate in more than one language and can be thought of as a continuum of language skills in which proficiency in any of the languages used may fluctuate over time and across social settings, conversational partners, and topics, among other variables. However, bilingualism is a controversial subject in terms of its true definition. On one side, it is argued that bilingualism has a narrow definition, one that essentially describes a perfect bilingual, where being bilingual means to be able to speak two languages perfectly. This narrow definition of bilingualism describes an individual who is close to being two monolinguals in one who has native-like control of two languages, and one with high levels of proficiency in both languages in both the written and oral modes. Actually, Webster's dictionary offers a relatively narrow definition of the terms bilingual and bilingualism, defining bilingual as having or using two languages, especially as spoken with the fluency characteristic of a native speaker, or a person using two languages especially habitually and with control like that of a native speaker, and it defines bilingualism as the constant oral use of two languages. On the other side of that argument, bilingualism is defined with a broader definition, one that describes what one could call an imperfect bilingual. This broad definition of bilingualism says that a bilingual is anyone who possesses a minimal competence in only one of the four language skills, listening, comprehension, speaking, reading, and writing, in a language other than his mother tongue. This definition says that bilingualism is a common human condition that makes it possible for an individual to function at some level in more than one language. It argues that bilinguals have varying proficiencies in comprehension and/or speaking skills depending on the immediate area of expertise in which the individual is called upon to use their two languages. While the true definition of bilingualism is a controversial one, it is safe to say that a bilingual individual can be classified along a continuum. When considering the length of time that passes, or lack thereof, between the learning of the first language, which is commonly referred to as L1 and will be referred to as such in this presentation, and the second language, or L2, there are two resulting types of bilingualism: simultaneous and sequential. Simultaneous bilingualism refers to the acquisition of two languages at the same time, typically with both languages introduced prior to the age of 3. Therefore, a simultaneous bilingual would be defined as one who acquires two languages simultaneously as a first language. Sequential bilingualism, in contrast, refers to a second language being introduced after age 3, at which time some level of proficiency has already been established in the first language. This type of bilingualism is also referred to as successive bilingualism or second language acquisition, or SLA. Therefore, a sequential bilingual is defined as one who acquires L2 after L1 is acquired. Comparisons of bilingual persons are made through analyzing the similarities and differences between these individuals in terms of several key dimensions. The dimensions we will define in this presentation include the age of acquisition of the second language, the circumstances leading to bilingualism, which may also factor in the level of formal education received in each language, the description of functional ability or degree of proficiency in L2, the description of the relationship between L1 and L2, the description of the context of acquisitions and of its effects on the bilingual's two language systems, which may be affected by the circumstances in which the two languages are used, and also the pattern of use of the two languages in the surrounding community, and finally, the description of stages in the lives of bilinguals. When comparing bilinguals in terms of the age of acquisition of the second language, the bilingual can be assigned one of two labels: an early bilingual or a late bilingual. An early bilingual is defined as one who acquired L2 in infancy or early childhood, and a late bilingual is defined as one who acquired L2 in adolescence or adulthood. When comparing bilinguals in terms of the circumstances leading to bilingualism, which may also factor in the level of formal education received in each language, the bilingual can be assigned one of two labels: an elite, academic, or elective bilingual, and a natural, folk, or circumstantial bilingual. An elite bilingual is defined as one who chooses to become bilingual or elects to take courses in L2. This type of bilingual is again one who chooses to study a second language and who receives a formal education in foreign language studies. These qualities indicate that the individual gives some sort of value to the language learned. A natural bilingual, on the other hand, is defined as one who is forced by circumstances to become bilingual and who is usually part of a group of individuals who become bilingual. These types of bilinguals are often people who grow up in communities where several languages are spoken, and the second language acquisition could be imposed upon the individual due to several factors such as needing to speak the language in order to learn at school, to talk to a friend, or at work, among other situations. This imposition of the language learning may affect the individual's attitude towards the second language in a negative way, which may result in the individual coming to resent the language and the culture and people associated with it. The characteristics of natural bilinguals that we've just discussed are reflected in the following definition of English language learners, or ELLs, a universally accepted term that is commonly used in K-12 settings that refers to language minority students in the United States who are learning English, the majority language, for social integration and educational purposes. Again, this definition reveals that ELLs would be categorized as natural, folk, or circumstantial bilinguals due to the fact that they are learning English not by their own volition, but, as the definition says, for social integration and educational purposes. When comparing bilinguals in terms of the description of their functional ability or degree of proficiency in L2, the bilingual can be assigned one of three labels: a receptive bilingual, an incipient bilingual, or a productive bilingual. A receptive bilingual is defined as one who can comprehend the L2 when it is spoken or written. An incipient bilingual is defined as one who is beginning to acquire L2, and a productive bilingual is defined as one who can speak and/or write the L2. When comparing individuals in terms of the description of the relationship between the bilingual's two languages, the bilingual can be assigned one of two labels: an ambilingual or an equilingual, which is also known as a balanced bilingual. An ambilingual is defined as an individual with a native competency in two languages or two native speakers in one, while an equilingual or balanced bilingual is defined as one who has proficiency in both languages. While the definitions of these two terms make them sound quite similar, perhaps it will clarify things to say that an equilingual can use his or her languages with equal but not necessarily native proficiency. When comparing individuals in terms of the description of the context of acquisitions of the two languages and of its effects on the bilingual's two language systems, which may be affected by the circumstances in which the two languages are used and also the pattern of use of the two languages and the surrounding community, the bilingual can be assigned one of two labels: a coordinate bilingual or a compound bilingual. A coordinate bilingual is defined as one whose languages are acquired in different cultural contexts and whose language systems for each language are separate. In this type, the individual learns the languages separately or in separate environments and maintains this separation after mastering both languages. For example, a coordinate bilingual may be a student who speaks one language at home, acquired via his or her parents in the home environment, and then learns a second language at school. The student only speaks the second language at school in a classroom environment, and the languages remain separate in his or her mind. A compound bilingual, on the other hand, is defined as one whose languages are acquired in the same context and whose language systems are in turn merged to some degree. In this type, there is no such dividing line as there is in coordinate bilingualism. The individual learns the languages in the same environment and context, and the languages are often used concurrently or even interchangeably. For example, a compound bilingual may be a child who is raised by bilingual parents, and both languages are used in the home. In the child's mind, the languages are not separate and can be switched between at will, even while speaking. Finally, when comparing individuals in terms of the description of the stage of life they are in as it relates to language learning and use, the bilingual can be assigned one of two labels: an ascendant bilingual or a recessive bilingual. An ascendant bilingual is defined as a bilingual whose functional ability in L2 is growing, while a recessive bilingual is defined as a bilingual whose functional ability in L2 is decreasing. Ascendant bilinguals are in the stage of language learning where L2 is developing, while recessive bilinguals are in the stage of life where they are no longer developing L2 and are not using the language as much, which may ultimately result in the loss of the language. I would now like to apply the terms we've just discussed to an actual bilingual person so that they may become more concrete. So I have gone ahead and assigned the correct labels out of each of the key dimensions we've talked about to myself, as I am bilingual, with my primary language being English and my secondary language being Spanish. To give you some background, I learned Spanish through a Spanish immersion program which I participated in from kindergarten through 12th grade. In the program, my classmates and I were taught in Spanish for up to half of each school day, with social studies, language arts, math, and science almost always being taught in Spanish, along with an actual Spanish class each year as well. I am currently continuing my Spanish studies through a secondary major of Spanish at WKU. Now, when it comes to each key dimension we've discussed, In terms of the relationship that exists between my acquisition of English and Spanish, I would be considered a sequential bilingual as opposed to a simultaneous bilingual because I learned English first and spoke only English until age 5 when I started kindergarten and began learning Spanish. Due to the fact that I had an established level of proficiency in my primary language before learning my second language, I would be considered a sequential bilingual. In terms of how old I was when I acquired Spanish, I would be considered an early bilingual as opposed to a late bilingual because I acquired my second language in early childhood rather than in adolescence or adulthood. In terms of the circumstances leading to my bilingualism, I would be considered an elite, academic, or elective bilingual as opposed to a natural, folk, or circumstantial bilingual because I chose to become bilingual and elected to take courses in Spanish through the Spanish immersion program I was in and through my Spanish major in college, and was not forced by any circumstance to become bilingual. In terms of my functional ability in Spanish, I would be considered to be a productive bilingual as opposed to either a receptive or incipient bilingual because I can both speak and write in Spanish and am not still in the stage of only understanding Spanish or only beginning to acquire Spanish. In terms of my relationship between English and Spanish, I would be considered an equilingual rather than an ambilingual because I am proficient in both languages but not proficient to the point of native competency in Spanish as an ambilingual would be. In terms of the context in which I acquire and use each language, I would be considered a coordinate bilingual rather than a compound bilingual because I acquired English in my home and social environments and acquired Spanish in my academic environment, and I continue to use each language in those same contexts for the majority of the time. Finally, in terms of the stage of life I'm in when it comes to the status of my functional ability in Spanish, I would be considered an ascendant bilingual rather than a recessive bilingual because my functional ability in Spanish is growing rather than decreasing as I am still taking Spanish classes and actively trying to improve my Spanish speaking abilities. We will now take a look at the 5 stages of second language acquisition, which are 1. Pre-production, also known as the silent or receptive period, 2. Early production, 3. Speech emergence, 4. Intermediate fluency, and 5. Advanced fluency, also known as continued language development. The first stage, known as pre-production or the silent or receptive period, lasts for 0 to 6 months, and the new language learner develops a vocabulary of approximately 500 words. During this time, the individual begins learning vocabulary in the second language, has very few, if any, oral skills in the second language, and may only respond to someone speaking the second language in a nonverbal way, such as pointing, gesturing, nodding, or drawing, for example. They cannot speak the second language with any real fluency or understanding, and they begin to practice pronouncing new words, or at least some argue that they do. This is actually a controversial stage among language educators due to the fact that some believe that new language learners are totally silent while in this stage of learning, as the name of the stage suggests, while others believe that because speech is fundamental in language acquisition, learners apply what they learn as they learn it, rather than staying silent. The second stage, known as early production, lasts for 6 months to a year, and the new language learner develops a vocabulary of approximately 1,000 words. During this time, the individual has a greater understanding while listening to the second language and can produce a limited number of words, phrases, and simple sentences, while they may not be grammatically correct. The third stage, known as speech emergence, which is sometimes described as survival English, lasts for 1 to 3 years, and the new language learner develops a vocabulary of approximately 3,000 words. During this time, the individual gains even greater comprehension in the second language, begins reading and writing in their second language, communicates through short phrases, sentences, and questions, but still makes grammatical errors and pronunciation errors. The fourth stage, known as intermediate fluency, lasts for 3 to 5 years, and the new language learner develops a vocabulary of approximately 6,000 words. During this time, the individual begins to actually think in their second language, which in turn helps them to gain a higher proficiency when speaking. The individual also acquires the ability to communicate via writing and speech using more complex sentences. He or she demonstrates increased levels of accuracy and correctness in terms of grammar and pronunciation, and is able to express their thoughts and feelings in the second language. Finally, the last stage, known as advanced fluency or continued language development, lasts for 5 to 7 years, and the individual develops a content area vocabulary, or a vocabulary that consists of nearly all the words needed in the content area in which they use the second language. During this stage, the individual's vocabulary continues to grow, and he or she produces the second language while utilizing varied grammatical structures and vocabulary words. At this point, the individual has mastered the second language in all of its complexities and nuances, and is comparable to native speakers of the same language. We will now discuss a few of the major normal processes and phenomena of second language acquisition, which are interference or transfer, the silent period, code switching, and language loss. To begin, interference, which is interchangeable with the term transfer, is defined as the imposition of previously learned patterns onto a new learning situation. Interference manifests itself in second language acquisition by way of a new language learner transferring an aspect of their first language to their second language due to a lack of linguistic knowledge of the second language. This may take form in the transfer of speech sounds, syntactic structures, grammatical features, word meanings, and even pragmatic performance, including turn-taking, address terms, politeness markers, and nonverbal communication patterns from the native or dominant language to the second language. If you would like to know more about what transfer might look like and some concrete examples of phonological, syntactical, and semantic transfer from Spanish to English specifically, please refer to the video lecture that's linked in the description below about Spanish-influenced English. Now back to interference. It is important to note that the ability to acquire a second language system and the amount of time it takes to do so can be easily predicted by the ease of transfer between the two languages. That is to say that if there are only a few similarities between two languages, there would be a poor ease of transfer between those two languages in terms of speech sounds, syntactic structures, grammatical features, word meanings, and so on, and as a result, the new language learner would have a difficult time acquiring the second language system, and it would take longer for them to do so than someone whose second language shares many similarities with the aforementioned elements of their first language. Finally, the knowledge of the native language and the acquisition of a foreign language can have either a facilitative or inhibitive effect on the new language learner's progress in mastering a new language. Which leads me to my next point about positive and negative transfer, also known as facilitation and inhibition. Positive transfer, or facilitation, occurs when two language systems' structures align well with each other and provide an ease of transition. An example of positive transfer is cognates. Cognates are word pairs within the same language or from different languages that share form and meaning. If words across a new language learner's native and foreign languages often share form, or the words sound the same, and meaning, or the words mean the same thing, it will naturally be easier for this learner to quickly and accurately acquire words in the new language, because they are able to draw upon their first language system for understanding when transitioning to the other language system. Negative transfer or inhibition, on the other hand, occurs when differences between the structures of two languages lead to systematic errors in the learning of a second language. In other words, negative transfer exists when two language systems do not match well in structure or meaning, and the ability to draw upon one system for understanding when transitioning to the other is not readily available. The next normal phenomenon of second language acquisition that we will discuss is the silent period, which we have actually already identified as the first of the 5 stages of second language acquisition, and you may recall that it is also referred to as pre-production or the receptive period, but we will go more in depth here into what this period actually consists of. When children are first exposed to a second language, they frequently focus on listening and comprehension before they begin to produce any words in the new language. These children are often very quiet, speaking little as they focus on understanding the new language, which is similar to what adults may do when traveling in foreign countries. The younger the child is, the longer the silent period tends to last. So older children may remain in a silent period for a few weeks or a few months, whereas preschoolers may be relatively silent for a year or more. The third normal process of second language acquisition that we will discuss is code switching. Code switching can be defined as the changing of languages over phrases or sentences, or the substitution of words in L2 for words in L1. In the realm of semantics, code switching is one of the most obvious types of forward cue transfer, or the application of knowledge from one's native language and the acquisition of their second language. Code switching is used by adults and children alike, as normal adult bilinguals often code switch in order to add emphasis to what they are saying, and generally only code switch when they know that their audience will understand it, while children, on the other hand, may code switch when it is the only way they know to express an idea. The fourth and final normal phenomenon of SLA that we will discuss is called language loss or subtractive bilingualism. Language loss occurs when, as an individual learns L2, he or she loses skills and fluency in L1 if the L1 is not reinforced and maintained through study and practice. This can be detrimental both cognitively and linguistically to a child's learning and to his or her family's lives. This is true especially if the child's parents speak only the native language and none of the second language, as then the child and parent's ability to communicate with each other would decrease dramatically. The opposite of language loss or subtractive bilingualism is called additive bilingualism, and this process occurs when an individual learns L2 while the language and culture of L1 are maintained and reinforced. Additive bilingualism, unlike subtractive bilingualism, is the ideal and desired language ability for children. We will now discuss 4 theories of bilingual language acquisition, which are simply theories about how individuals learn a second language. Each of the theories we will look at in this presentation are proposed by Professor Jim Cummins, one of the world's leading authorities on bilingual education and second language acquisition. The first theory we will discuss demonstrates the idea that second language learners acquire social and academic language differently, and Cummins demonstrates this idea through 2 language continua called BICS, or Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills, and CALP, or Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency. The second theory we will look at is called the Common Underlying Proficiency Model, which is the basis of the hypothesis called the Linguistic Interdependence hypothesis. The third is the thresholds theory, and the fourth is the Communicative Proficiency Model, which is also sometimes referred to as simply the 4-quadrant model. The BICS and CALP theory makes a distinction between the acquisition of social language, or BICS, and academic language, or CALP. BICS and CALP are terms that are commonly used in discussion of bilingual education, and they demonstrate Jim Cummins' ideas about the 2 principal fields of second language development in a simple matrix. BICS, or Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills, describes the development of conversational fluency in the second language, whereas CALP, or Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency, describes the use of language in decontextualized academic situations. BICS are classified as the communicative skills of listening and speaking that are needed in social situations. The interactions that make up this social proficiency would occur in authentic social contexts and are usually context-embedded, meaning that they include many physical and visual supports to support the communicative exchange. BICS are not considered to be demanding cognitive tasks, and the language required for BICS is not specialized. And finally, second language learners develop BICS rather quickly, in about 1 to 3 years, as opposed to CALP, which takes a considerably longer amount of time to develop due to the nature of complexity and lack of support involved. CALP refers to the student's academic learning in various subject areas. This level of language learning is essential for students to succeed in school, and it includes the oral and written production skills of speaking and writing, as well as the oral and written comprehension skills of listening and reading in content areas. As a student gets older, the context of academic tasks is reduced, and the language is more cognitively demanding, meaning that there are fewer clues or supports to help students comprehend content information. Therefore, this continua of academic proficiency takes generally around 5 to 8 years to develop in second language learners, which is considerably longer than it takes for these students to develop their social communication proficiency. Here is a graphic representation of the areas of social and academic communication that we've just talked about. As we've already discussed, BICS can be described as conversational, social, or everyday language. It takes around 1 to 3 years to achieve fluency in BICS, and as we know from identifying the 5 stages of second language acquisition, as well as some of the major processes and phenomena of SLA, second language learners often go through a silent period at the beginning of their second language learning. Again, as we've already discussed, CALP can be described as school, textbook, or academic language, and it usually takes a minimum of 5 to 8 years to develop an intermediate academic fluency, but takes a lifetime to develop fully. BICS and CALP are represented in an iceberg on the right side of this graphic because it is of the utmost importance that educators look beyond a student's BICS to guarantee that they are moving forward in their academic language acquisition. Because there is often a disparity found between the language that second language learners use for conversation and that which is used for more academic purposes, teachers can often misjudge the language level of these learners, leading to misconceptions about the intelligence or motivation levels of the students. So, it is important to understand the main differences between BICS and CALP, that BICS takes 1 to 3 years to develop, it is more surface level, it involves familiar content, face-to-face conversation, high-frequency vocabulary or around 2,000 familiar words, simple sentence structure, and takes place in low-pressure situations. In contrast, CALP takes 5 to 8 years to develop, it is more abstract, it includes lectures, formal text, written text, specialized terminology, humor, culture, idioms, textbook language, social appropriateness, nonverbal communication, less familiar content, low-frequency vocabulary, and is decontextualized, and it usually takes place in high-pressure situations. The common underlying proficiency model is what we will take a look at next, and it is the basis of the linguistic interdependence hypothesis. In this hypothesis, Jim Cummins proposes that every language has surface features that are unique to that language. However, underlying those features are proficiencies that are common across languages. This idea supports what Cummins further proposes, that when students learn one language, they acquire a bank of skills and implicit metalinguistic knowledge that equips them to learn subsequent languages, and that they can draw upon when they learn subsequent languages. This common underlying proficiency provides the base language support for both the student's first and second language, and anything that is learned in either language becomes part of the individual's so-called bank to be drawn upon when needed across languages. This theory has also been used to explain why it becomes easier to learn a third or fourth language, with the explanation being that previous knowledge of one's native language serves to support his or her understanding of basic skills and concepts related to a language, and thus a second language should theoretically come easier to him or her, as would a third or fourth as the individual progresses. The common underlying proficiency model is represented with the dual iceberg metaphor or model, which suggests that a second language learner's first and second language are the two tips of the iceberg that we can see above the surface, with a common basis below the surface of common underlying proficiencies involving more cognitively demanding tasks such as literacy, content learning, abstract thinking, and problem solving that are common across languages. Jim Cummins' thresholds theory says that a minimum threshold in language proficiency must be passed before a second language speaker can reap any benefits from the second language. This idea can be used to explain the relationship between bilingualism and cognition, where individuals with high levels of proficiency in both languages experience cognitive advantages in terms of linguistic and cognitive flexibility, while those with low levels of proficiency in both languages experience cognitive deficits. It is important to note here that the more developed the first language, the easier it will be to develop the second language, or in other words, a strong first language can support the development of a second language. But conversely, the lower competency in the first language, the harder it is to achieve bilingualism. This hypothesis further describes two distinct processes of bilingualism called additive bilingualism and subtractive bilingualism. Additive bilingualism is a process by which students develop both fluency and proficiency in a second language while continuing to develop proficiency in their first. Subtractive bilingualism, on the other hand, is a process in which students, instead of adding a second language, actually replace their first language with the second language. Here's a graphic that represents the thresholds theory. As you can see, there are two thresholds. Towards the bottom of the image, there's the first threshold, which is the minimum for children to reach in order to avoid the negative effects of bilingualism. Below this threshold is when children have a limited competency in both languages. Between the two thresholds, children are competent in one language but are not yet able to transfer skills between the first language and the second language. Above the second threshold allows for the possibility of positive cognitive effects that correspond to the age-appropriate levels of competency in both languages. Along with the thresholds and the two distinct processes of bilingualism that this theory describes, it also describes the three types of bilinguals: balanced or proficient bilinguals, less balanced or partial bilinguals, and limited bilinguals. We can see on this graphic that limited bilinguals are those with low levels of competence in both languages, with likely negative cognitive effects. Less balanced or partial bilinguals have age-appropriate competence in one, but not two, languages, and it is unlikely that there will be any positive or negative cognitive consequences. And lastly, balanced or proficient bilinguals have age-appropriate competence in both languages, and there are likely to be positive cognitive advantages. This theory also has significant implications for immersion programs, as biliteracy is an important goal, and students should be literate in both languages and benefit, therefore, from being balanced bilinguals. The final theory of bilingual language acquisition that we will look at in this presentation is the communicative proficiency model, which is sometimes more simply referred to as the 4-quadrant model. This model focuses attention on the level of linguistic and contextual challenges in classroom activities. It is a reminder that cognitive challenge can be kept high for students learning a second language when the activities are sourced in a supportive context and appropriate scaffolding is provided. Scaffolding is a teaching strategy which involves moving students progressively towards stronger and greater independence in the learning process. There are 4 quadrants in this model: cognitively undemanding tasks that are context-embedded, cognitively undemanding tasks that are context-reduced, cognitively demanding tasks that are context-embedded, and cognitively demanding tasks that are context-reduced. Here is a graphic that represents the communicative proficiency or 4-quadrant model. In the first quadrant, or Quadrant A, which describes cognitively undemanding tasks that are context-embedded, language tasks are very concrete and involve the everyday communication in the classroom. These types of tasks are typically seen during classroom routines, such as greetings, calendar and weather, and sharing about recess or the weekend. In this stage of the framework, there would be a lot of oral language, visual supports, and the use of the L1 to support the L2. Some more examples of these types of tasks would be copying from the board, reading a map, having a face-to-face conversation, selecting food in the cafeteria, and following directions or illustrations with visuals or diagrams. In the second quadrant, or Quadrant B, which describes cognitively undemanding tasks that are context-reduced, language tasks use fewer oral and visual supports but are within students' abilities. Examples of these tasks might include following a class schedule, getting an absence excuse, having a conversation over the phone, following written directions or instructions with no diagrams or illustrations, giving an oral presentation, and following oral classroom directions with no gestures or body language. In the third quadrant, or Quadrant C, which describes cognitively demanding tasks that are context-embedded, learning tasks are scaffolded through visual and personal supports such as the image itself, graphic organizers, personal dictionaries, collaboration, and conferences with the teacher. Examples of these tasks might be demonstrations, science experiments, basic math computations, and social studies lessons with visuals and graphics. And finally, in the fourth quadrant, or Quadrant D, which describes cognitively demanding tasks that are context-reduced, language tasks would involve students using what they know and have learned to argue, evaluate, analyze, and make judgments. Examples of these tasks might be completing a standardized test, utilizing math concepts and applications, listening to a lecture, and reading textbooks about subjects like science, social studies, and literature. We will now move from discussing bilingualism to discussing multilingualism. Let's first begin with some definitions. A multilingual can be defined as a person who speaks more than 2 languages, but is used often to refer to a person who speaks 4 languages or more. And multilingualism can be defined as a product of the environment, of early childhood exposure, and of informal language acquisition, as opposed to formal language learning. It is also important to note that multilingualism is usually a question of fate, birth, or parental choice. Now, going one step above a multilingual person and their multilingualism is a polyglot and their polyglottery. A polyglot is someone who has a high degree of proficiency in 5 or more languages and is distinct from a multilingual in that he or she is an individual who electively learns multiple languages, most likely due to an obsessive passion for learning languages, as opposed to learning them out of necessity from being forced by circumstances. Polyglottery, again, unlike multilingualism, is usually a question of choice and is an act of conscious study. Now let's look at a breakdown of language abilities across the globe, including monolinguals, bilinguals, trilinguals, multilinguals, and polyglots. We've just identified what kind of language ability constitutes a multilingual and a polyglot, but let's define what constitutes a monolingual, bilingual, and trilingual as well. A monolingual is a person knowing only one language. A bilingual, for the purpose of this data, is a person using or able to use 2 languages, especially with equal fluency, and a trilingual is a person speaking 3 languages fluently. As you can see by looking at this pie chart, monolinguals make up 40% of the world's population, bilinguals are the largest group at 43%, trilinguals make up 13%, multilinguals make up only 3%, and polyglots make up a mere 1%. I would now like to discuss further about monolingualism, bilingualism, and trilingualism. Monolingualism is usually observed in English-speaking countries such as the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, or New Zealand, largely due to the perception that learning a second language is of little relevance or importance because the majority of the world already speaks English as a first or second language. Bilingualism, as we've just learned, is the language ability that is observed most prevalently in the world and is noticeable, for example, within the Hispanic community in the United States, who often speak both English and Spanish, French-speaking countries in Africa where people often speak French in their native language, and immigrants in general who migrate from their native countries to English-speaking countries. And finally, trilingualism is prevalent in Hong Kong, where people often speak Mandarin, Cantonese, and English, Norway, where people often speak Norwegian, Swedish, and English, in the Philippines, where people often speak Tagalog, Spanish, and English, and in other countries not listed here in which more than one foreign influence is present. To conclude this presentation, I would like to discuss where one might find truly immersive multilingualism or truly multilingual societies and why. Starting with the why, there are several contributing factors that might lead to a multilingual society. For one, any kind of foreign influence present in a country or society might lead the inhabitants of said area to need to learn and speak multiple languages other than their primary language, or in other words, living in a country that is influenced by other cultures might lead the individuals living there to become multilingual. Another leading factor in the category of multilingualism is a diversity in the vocabulary of a native language. For example, Moroccan is rich with foreign words, containing a mixture of Arabic, French, and Spanish words. So naturally, it would follow that Morocco is a multilingual society where people often speak Moroccan, Arabic, French, Spanish, and English. Another factor that would contribute to the establishment of a multilingual society is the existence of different language demands based on the setting in which someone is in, like needing to speak one language at home and another with friends, at school, or at work, for example. And lastly, living in a country with open borders to other nations that speak different languages is also a contributing factor to a multilingual society or culture. Two countries that are known to have high percentages of multilinguals and polyglots are Switzerland, where people often speak German, Italian, French, Romansh, and English, and Morocco, which I've already mentioned, where people often speak Moroccan, Arabic, French, Spanish, and English.